During the invasion of France by Axis forces in May-June 1941, French army remained undefeated from one end of the campaign to the other. It was the Army of the Alps. This one, although reduced to a third of its strength, faced the situation with incredible success, not only against over 300,000 men in two Italian armies, but also against the arrival of several German armored divisions at its rear. This incredible story is often wrongly reduced to a few heroic feats of arms that don't do it justice, thanks to the performance of this army, which I invite you to discover today. Italy's entry into the war had a unique context for both France and Italy. On the Italian side, entering the war in June 1940 was just as opportunistic as it was poorly prepared, having declared itself non-belligerent in September 1939. Mussolini's Italy initially feared a possible French offensive that never came, which nevertheless led him and his generals to concentrate Italian forces facing the French Alps. However, there is disorganization within the Italian army and the roles within the high command are poorly defined. The generals range from capable professionals to downright mediocre in quality. Meanwhile, the ground troops are generally ill-equipped and unprepared for potential offensive operations in the mountains. In short, Italy is hesitant about what stance to take toward France and is especially poorly preparing for war. Illustrating this hesitation, Mussolini mobilizes Italian conscripts in September 1939 only to demobilize them a few weeks later and then remobilize them in the spring 1940. While still waiting either for a French offensive or for significant German advances, we will actually have the opportunity to see all of this in more detail when we get to the analysis of the forces involved. When Italy enters the war on June 10, 1940 in the evening, France is already nearly defeated. The French army, although efficiently reorganized and remotivated by the Supreme Commander Maxime Weygand, is no longer able to hold back the German advance evenly across the entire front. However, it is only from June 13 that all the armies of the Northeast Front begin to retreat as the French army loses all cohesion in this sector. While the French army collapses in the north, the situation is entirely different for the Army of the Alps, and this is thanks to its leader, General René Hollery. Between September 1939 and June 1940, the Army of the Alps was reduced by two-thirds of its troops, who were urgently moved to the northeastern front, and they would not return before the end of the campaign. The Army of the Alps, initially comprised of 550,000 men, had only 180,000 remaining by June 10, with just 85,000 combat troops. These are distributed among 3 infantry divisions, which are mainly made up of reservists, as well as within 86 ski scout sections, 49 Alpine fortress battalions, and 812 cannons. For accuracy, the ski scout sections are not necessarily Alpine troops. This is simply a subunit of a battalion whose garrison is located in the mountains. The section can be attached to an Alpine, regular infantry, or colonial infantry battalion, which, due to the type of combat it may encounter, must have a reconnaissance unit capable of operating effectively in the mountains. Where the severe reduction in the strength of the Army of the Alps would have served as an excuse for others. This simply pushes General Hollery to develop a strategy and a system adapted to his situation. The artillery officer general is familiar with the Alpine theater, having been stationed there since the early 1930s. Unlike what many French forces experienced during the Phoney War, that is, the period between the outbreak of the war in September 1939 and the German offensive in May 1940, General Hollery effectively utilizes the time provided by Italy's delay, as they declared non-belligerency in September 1939. He thus ensures that his men are rigorously trained, keeps them active and alert, and prepares them as best as possible for the confrontation that awaits them. He also offers an interesting tactical reasoning. While relying on favorable terrain, he sets up a layered defensive system in 3 tiers. Outposts are set up closest to the Italian borders, usually manned by ski hunter sections. Their objective is to slow down and weaken the enemy while preventing any sudden attacks. Only after that comes what he calls the line of resistance, which is in practice a defensive system based on solid fortifications, supported by cleverly positioned artillery. This system is nicknamed the Alpine Maginot Line, and its purpose is to absorb the offensive and then keep the enemy at bay. The third layer consists of a system to slow down the enemy in case there was a failure within the block that forms the line of resistance. This relies on demolitions and obstacles, thus giving the Army of the Alps time to react and reposition itself effectively. This is precisely what was missing in the Ardennes sector, where General Insige performed considerably worse, despite having greater resources. But then, what did the Italians prepare to break through this system? Well, Italy entrusted command of the sector to Prince Umberto di Savoia and mobilized no less than 2 armies for the offensive. These are massing at the French-Italian border. 312,000 men, including 2,110 combatants, divided among 22 infantry divisions. The Italians have a clear numerical advantage with 4 Alpine divisions, 3 motorized divisions, and an estimated 2,300 to 3,000 cannons. But despite this, things really won't go as planned for the Italian army. The Battle of the Alps in 1940 did not begin on June 10th at the declaration of war, but only 11 days later, starting from the morning of June 21st. But why? Surprisingly, the 2 Italian armies are not prepared to launch the attack until June 10th. In fact, the armed forces have only set up a defensive, not an offensive, arrangement in order to prevent a hypothetical French offensive operation. For their part, the senior Italian officers, who were not exactly overwhelmed with work in the weeks leading up to the declaration of war, didn't even bother to come up with a plan. Not even a draft of attack plans, which means they are caught off guard when war is declared. As a result, on June 10th, the 2 Italian armies have no attack plan, are not in position, and are neither materially nor morally prepared for the operations expected of them. Consequently, except for some minor clashes, the Southeast Front stays quiet until June 21st morning. And so, it is during this short period of time that the Italian command is given the mission to organize a large-scale offensive against a French army, which is certainly significantly smaller in number but is well prepared and organized. However, organization within the highest levels of the Italian command is lacking at that time. Due to an insufficiently clear distribution of roles, made worse by political appointments, in principle, Prince Umberto di Savoia commands the theater of operations. Despite lacking the character or talent of a military leader, his impact on the organization of operations is limited. As a result, from June 10th, it is Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, Chief of Staff of the Italian Army, who rushes to the sector in an emergency. When he learns of the declaration of war, he is nevertheless forced to be accompanied by a general under Mussolini's orders, while also being bypassed in some of his instructions by his theoretical superior, who has remained in Rome. This is Marshal Badoglio, who was then commanding all of the Italian armed forces. Despite the chaotic atmosphere, the Italian army devises an attack plan, focusing its forces at 3 points. To leverage its numerical superiority, the Italian army must advance simultaneously on 3 fronts. And the first push must therefore be carried out from the Col du Petit Saint-Bernard toward the Tarentaise Valley, the second from the Col de la Maddalena towards the Ubaye Valley, and the third from the coast towards Menton. On the ground, however, Italian disorganization means that the start of the battle looks more like a general offensive along the entire front, although you can still make out the outlines of the plan just mentioned. In this context, on the morning of June 21st, the Italian army launches a major offensive while the remaining French army continues to disintegrate. The army of the Alps is alone, facing its destiny. The Italians, with a significant numerical advantage, launch a major offensive against the Tarentaise Valley. On June 21, 48,550 French soldiers faced 52,000 Italian soldiers, a ratio of 6-1. The latter launch a mass attack on several fronts, aiming to break through the French defensive line around Bourg Saint-Maurice. However, the benefit of this immense Italian superiority is restricted by the landscape and the superb French preparations. Thus, on the French side, in parentheses as elsewhere, each battalion can rely on one or more artillery supports that can concentrate their fire on a specific point. From the start of the offensive, the skilled Italian mountain troops, the Alpini, are halted in the north by the 80th Alpine Fortress Battalion, whose sections hold the passes. The next day, a massive and motorized assault is launched from the Petit Saint-Bernard Pass towards Bourg Saint-Maurice. The renowned Italian light infantry units, the Bersaglieri, participate in this major assault with armored vehicle support. But they too are stopped that same day by the French defensive system, and only make little progress in the following days. This occurred despite intense Italian artillery bombardments on French redoubts and defensive works. On the evening of June 24th, the Army of the Alps wins a brilliant victory in this sector. In 4 days of fighting, 792 Italian soldiers are put out of action, compared to only 47 French soldiers. The French army excels further south, against the 2nd Italian advance axis. In the Lubai Valley, the battles in the Ubai Valley are intense and bloody. The Italian command masses 52,000 men against 15,000 French soldiers defending the sector. The Italian soldiers, especially the Alpini, managed to push back several of the French outposts held by ski troops before being stopped by French artillery and several well-placed machine gun positions. This is the case, for example, of the Dronero Alpini Battalion, which due to poor planning ended up not at the initially targeted French outposts, but directly in the firing zone of the defensive works of the Alpine Maginot Line. The Italians then attempt an assault, certainly courageous but chaotic, during which the French do not hesitate to crush their attackers under the shells, causing a real carnage on the Italian side. The remnants of the Italian battalion are then forced into a painful retreat back to their initial positions. On the evening of the 24th, in this sector, the Italian losses are particularly heavy. More than 2,000 men are put out of action, while the French lose only 9 of their own. The Army of the Alps achieves a clear victory in this sector, despite the fierce fighting and the Italians' courage. However, a third axis of advance near Menton on the coast remains more favorable to the Italians. Knowing this, Mussolini's generals gather 80,000 soldiers there. The Menton sector is the third major axis of advance for the Italian army. In this logic, the army of the Kingdom of Italy amasses 80,000 of its soldiers there in order to overthrow the 35,000 French soldiers defending the sector. The French, aware of the vulnerability of a sector that is more exposed, have built more defensive structures there. Due to the French side's solid discipline and good preparation, the strong Italian offensive quickly turns into a farce. This is where you'll find the renowned Pont Saint-Louis outpost in this area. 9 French soldiers, backed by Maginot Alpine Line artillery, stall an Italian regiment for 5 days. The Italians also launch infantry assaults on other positions, particularly those held by ski troops. But these assaults, brave as they are disorganized and poorly supported by their own artillery and achieve nothing concrete. Their sole effect is to cause sorrow for hundreds of Italian families. These failures make them skip these roles, not realizing the challenge is actually greater beyond them. Because there, they are brutally met by the real line of defense, embodied by the Maginot Alpine Line. Without any real success other than costly movements in terms of lives, the Italian army only manages to drag itself as far as the border town of Menton, which it fails to conquer completely. And so, at the cost of more than 1,000 Italian soldiers, for just 65 Frenchmen, the Italian army also fails to break through the French defenses here. However, the Italian attack occurs nearly along the full line, despite the intended attack plan. There are thus 2 other sectors that we would almost forget, and that would be a mistake since they involve several tens of thousands of men in violent battles, some of which almost went very badly. For the French, these are the sectors of Maurienne and Briançonnet. Fighting in Maurienne differs from other places. The Italians have less of a numerical advantage there than in other sectors. Since it's only 4-1 there, the attackers have advanced a bit more methodically. On June 21st, 40,000 Italian troops backed by armored vehicles and heavy artillery unleash a devastating attack on the valley. The effectiveness of the attack allows them not only to overcome several French outposts, but also to isolate several defensive structures. However, the French, trapped in their fortification, do not panic and stick to the instructions they have received and the mission they have been given. The relief of the encircled positions is then made possible by strong support from the French artillery, which once again brilliantly directed under the leadership of General Hollery, who mastered this weapon perfectly due to his training, wreaks havoc on the Italian side. However, the intervention of the Italian assault troops from the Alpine Valdora battalion is more effective. They reach the French defensive structures and rush, armed with explosives, into contact with the fortifications. But the French infantrymen from the Alpine fortress battalions, who remain vigilant, respond to the danger with a brutal sortie that surprises the Italians. The fighting becomes hand-to-hand and turns to the advantage of the French infantrymen, forcing the Valdora battalion into a disorderly retreat. In just 4 days, 1,183 Italian soldiers are put out of action in the sector, compared to 83 French. That's how, after an initial scare, the strength of the French defenses, set up by General Hollery, as well as the discipline of his soldiers, overcame an Italian offensive that locally had better prospects. But further south, in the border sector of Briançonnet, the Italians have a strong advantage, embodied by a fortified artillery position at high altitude, overlooking the surrounding heights, making it perfectly capable of bombarding the Briançon Valley. 30,000 of their soldiers are launched against 8,500 French. However, General Hollery had anticipated the sector's defensive challenges, so it is also fortified and well prepared. For example, he had powerful mortars placed in the sector, which he entrusted to a capable officer. On the very day the offensive began, it took only 3.5 hours for the officer in charge of the mortar batteries to neutralize most of the firepower of the fortified Italian artillery position. On the infantry side, the 91st Alpine Chasseur Battalion, consisting of reservists, valiantly defends the valley. The Italian Sforzesca Mountain Infantry Division is facing opposition at Montgenèvre, just a half-hour walk from the Italian border. The Italians suffer 714 casualties without capturing any French outposts in the area, while the French lose only 45 men. and the defense, as everywhere else, was flawlessly effective. The nearby Quai Rat Valley, being less suitable for a major assault, is understandably somewhat overlooked by the Italians. They only deployed 12,500 soldiers there against 7,500 French. The Italians failed to break through, losing 147 men, while the French hold their positions with only 15 casualties. But while the Italians are on June 24th effectively contained, even pushed back, it is at that moment that the German 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions open fire with their cannons on the rear of the Army of the Alps. In fact, General Hübner began preparing his offensive by massing forces as early as June 21st. 165,000 men, over 600 armored vehicles, and 250 artillery pieces behind the Army of the Alps. Thus, 2 panzer divisions, 1 motorized division, and 1 mountain infantry division are moving up from Lyon toward the Alps. The German general orders them to swiftly seize 4 key cities, Annecy, Chambéry, Grenoble, and Valence, to weaken the Army of the Alps' defensive positions. However, in response to this, General Hollery is fully aware of the tragic developments in the fighting in the north of the country. Consequently, the arrival of the Germans does not surprise him. He is nevertheless faced with a major problem. With most of his forces depleted in the weeks prior to these battles, he lacks reserves as his troops are fully engaged in repelling the Italian army. However, he shows resourcefulness and takes whatever he can get his hands on. That is to say, mainly the few units that managed to retreat from the northeastern front. He then assembles them into a group and entrusts them to General Cartier, who must defend the sector the Germans are targeting. The Northern Army's remnants struggled to unite, managing to assemble 35,000 men, 170 cannons of various quality, and about 10 armored vehicles organize a defense intended to protect the Army of the Alps from a powerful German armored offensive on its rear. Incredibly, the French successfully repel the German offensive, far from being ridiculous. The German General Hübner thus delays until the morning of June 24th in order to concentrate his forces and launch his offensive under good conditions. The 3rd Panzer Division is launched toward Grenoble in an offensive. However, it lacks caution in a rugged environment that is not favorable to it and does not actually expect an organized French defense. But this reasoning is a mistake, since the French have organized themselves and, although hastily, have prepared for this confrontation. The French artillery is once again perfectly positioned, giving them extremely favorable positions. They will use these positions to concentrate fire on several points, blocking the German advance and neutralizing the essential logistical support required by the panzer divisions. For their part, the infantry forms various defensive strongpoints, solid enough for the artillery to do its job. The fighting lasts all day, and when night falls, the French maintain their position as the 3rd Panzer Division is briefly neutralized. The Germans won't get a second chance, since an armistice is then signed. Both with Germany signed a few days earlier on June 22nd, and with Italy on the same day, June 24th. This largely ceased fighting between the French and both Italians and Germans, except for a few skirmishes after the French success. An analysis reveals that the Army of the Alps' success was not due to isolated heroic actions, but was structurally inherent. All along the front line, Ulrich's method worked. The positions are strategically selected and well supported. The fortifications are well designed, and the men, including reservists, are fully trained and combat ready. In fact, the strength of the Hollery system is particularly visible when it is put under pressure and challenged, as was the case in Ubai or in Maurienne. This system, with more men, would have likely held out against a well-organized army like the German army of that era. In fact, the astonishing unpreparedness and disorganization of the Italians is the other major factor explaining the French victory in the Alps. While the Italian soldiers showed real courage, which the French even mention with respect in their report, they suffered from their army's total disorganization, exposing flaws of some Italian commanders and political leaders at the time. Benito Mussolini, who was then the leader of fascist Italy, thus granted himself this at great cost, while dragging his country into a world war. Nothing more than a stool at the negotiating table with the French.